I'm going to be talking about UN procedures for protection, and then we're going to talk about litigation. I feel a little bit like a fraud because I'm talking about the CRPD committee when I'm not a member of the CRPD committee, unlike Teresa, and nor have I ever taken a case to the CRPD committee. But I have taken cases to lots of the other treaty bodies, and really that's where my experience lies, is in litigating equality cases, primarily violence against women and disability cases before international bodies, so the European Court of Human Rights, the European Social Charter Committee, the African Commission, sub-regional bodies in Africa, and the UN treaty bodies. I'm afraid this is going to be very much a practitioner's perspective. I'm not one of the academic people that you've been hearing from in the last few days, so I might not know the answers to some of your questions if they're about the convention, which is why I have Rosemary here and Janet, who will also be helping me, because it looked very Andrea Coomber heavy this morning. So they'll be talking to you about shadow reporting, and after the break, Rosemary and I'll be talking about litigation, and we thought it'd be good to have an opportunity to talk with you, for you to ask questions and make comments about cases that you think you could potentially take either to the CRPD committee or to regional bodies to the extent they exist in your region. So it would be great to have a kind of practical discussion about what to do with violations using legal processes. I'm a lawyer. I'll try to avoid too much legal language. I appreciate a lot of you aren't lawyers. If at any stage anything's unclear, please just wave me down if I start speaking too quickly. For the interpreters, please stop me. And I'd like as much as possible for you to ask questions as we go along, because we're going to be covering a lot of material, I'm afraid. We're covering the whole UN system of human rights in about an hour. So there's going to be a lot to cover. So if I'm not being clear, then please just stop me, or if you have a question, please stop me straight away. So let's see what we talk about. Well, first of all, talk about the treaty system of the UN, so the general system and the CRPD specifically. We'll look at the committee, how to contribute to its work, and then after the break, we'll talk about litigation and being strategic in the kind of cases that you take to the committee. There are two parts of the UN system in terms of human rights. One part is what we call the charter-based part that comes from the UN Charter, and that applies to all states by virtue of their membership of the United Nations. So yesterday Eric was talking about this UN Special Rapporteur on torture. So Juan Mendes has a mandate to look at torture across all United Nations countries. And that's based on the Charter. It's not based on any ratification of treaties. It's based purely on membership of the United Nations. So there's the Charter-based system, which is the Human Rights Council. When you hear about Universal Periodic Review and these things, that's part of the Human Rights Council. And then all the special rapporteurships and working groups of the UN and other bodies. I'm afraid I'm really simplifying it. The other part of the UN human rights system is the treaty body system, and that's what I'm going to be talking about this morning. And essentially, there are a raft of treaties. Oh God, what have I done? Okay, sorry. There are a whole lot of treaties. The core two treaties originally were the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, split in two because of Cold War politics, with the Americans not wanting to sign up to economic and social rights and the Soviets not wanting to sign up to civil and political rights. But from those two treaties come all of the rights we know now. And a number of the other treaties have been elaborated along thematic or about vulnerable groups. So there's the Convention Against Torture, elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, children, migrant workers, and most recently the CRPD. Now it's important to remember that all of those treaties all apply to people with disabilities. So you could take potentially cases to the CEDAW committee. The ones that have got asterisks next to them indicate that you can take individual complaints to them. In the case of the economic and social rights, not quite yet, but the others you can all take complaints to. So you could take a complaint of the kind of violations that Eric was talking about yesterday to the Committee Against Torture, for example. You could take a complaint to the Human Rights Committee based on the torture prevention provision of the ICCPR. So it's not like the CRPD sits in a vacuum. It sits within a family of treaties that all operate along very similar lines in their membership, in their operating, in their rules of procedure, in what they produce and what they do. But Gerard really thought it was very important that you understand that it's not just the CRPD. So there are all of these other treaties as well. And organisations like mine help people, individuals and organisations, take cases to pretty much all of them. Sorry. So it's worthwhile remembering that there are these other treaties. It's worthwhile looking the extent to which they engage with people with disabilities. And there have been cases, for example, from the Human Rights Committee on Disability. They've only ever engaged on really kind of severe detention dignity issues. So where people in wheelchairs have been unable to move for days on end, have been washed by people of the opposite sex, those kind of cases. There was a case called Hamilton in Jamaica, which dealt with those kind of issues many years ago. So it's worth having a look at and keeping an eye on them because there's a possibility for cross-fertilisation of the two. More interesting for us is the CRPD committee. So it's set up by Article 34 of the Convention. It has 18 experts, including people with disabilities, many of them people with disabilities. Many of them are people who come from a disability advocacy background. Some of them are lawyers, many of them are from other professions, which is good. There are too many lawyers in the world. They all serve in their private capacity, so they're not representing the state as such. Now, obviously, as with all treaty bodies, some members of treaty bodies are closer to their governments than others, and that's just the way these things go. They meet for 2 weeks each year in Geneva, and they report both to the General Assembly and to ECOSOC biennially. I think it's very important to remember, and they're appointed for 4-year terms, once renewable. It's important to remember that the human rights budget, and within that the disability budget of the United Nations, is minuscule. It's a tiny fraction. It's less than 1% of the whole UN budget. So the committee itself, while it is motivated and excited and doing great work, does not have a lot of resources behind it from the United Nations. So all of these people have full-time jobs. They have lives and other things to do, and they're not serving like judges at the European Court serve or judges at the African Court serve on a full-time paid basis. Okay, it's for Teresa, it's a hobby. It's something like I play tennis and do yoga. She sits on the CRPD committee. So I think we have to think about that in terms of taking cases, because you have to make life as easy as possible for the committee. We need to provide them with as much information and make our litigation as easy for them as we possibly can. It's mandated, importantly, to submit, to consider reports of state parties, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It has the optional protocol. It's been pretty widely ratified now. So where that's been ratified, they can receive communications from individuals and groups and conduct inquiries. And it also is empowered to interpret the convention through general comments, recommendations. And it's really important, I'll talk about that in a minute, in terms of understanding more detail what the convention's really about. So far, this is what I could gather from the website. So please, committee member, if you could correct any of this if it's wrong. They've held 7 sessions. They've adopted rules of procedure, which I've put in the materials for you. There are some really interesting things in the rules of procedure. We'll talk about that as we go through, but they are worth having a look at if you're interested in taking a case to the committee. They've had 3 full reporting cycles on Tunisia, Peru and Spain, and they're partway through a number of other countries. They've held 2 discussion days on accessibility and legal capacity. My understanding is they're in the process of drafting general comments on those things. Now, general comment is essentially an interpretive tool. So it's where the committee, and this committee and other committees, will basically set out in 5 or 10 pages its understanding of what accessibility means beyond what is in the convention. So it's an elaboration of their understanding. Incredibly significant because there's one little sentence in the convention. The general comments really give us a sense of what they think of that, where it comes from, the application of it, And in the work I do in litigation, they're critically important to see what will work with the committee, what will be successful, where there are gaps, and where we can probe further. So it's worth having a look at the general comments once they're adopted. As I think one of the speakers, maybe Eric yesterday said, or no Eric, somebody else, the other treaty bodies have adopted general comments that have referenced people with disabilities. That was Teresa, on General Comment 20 of the Economic and Social Rights Committee. But there haven't been an elaboration of the rights of people with disabilities yet in a way that we would hope and expect. They have received numerous individual communications. I think it's around 50 from what I heard last night through the wine. There's been one decision against Sweden, which we'll talk about in a minute. I think it's clear to say it's very early days for the committee. You know, they're really just establishing themselves, getting to know each other, working out what the convention means, because obviously there was a big excitement and move towards the adoption of the convention, and then you've got it, and now what do you do with it? So, I mean, that's really what this morning is going to be about. The state party reporting is a huge part of the work of the treaty body. It's, I have to say, not a part of the work that, because I don't work for a state, I have too much to do with. Janet and Rosemary will talk about state shadow reporting in a minute, which is the way NGOs can engage. But essentially, every 4 years, states who have ratified CRPD, or which have ratified CRPD, are required to submit a periodic report, which basically sets out what they've done to comply with the convention. And you can see these are on the website of the committee. So you can see, for example, all of the documentation to date on Tunisia, Spain and Peru, and you can see the reports that have been submitted by China and Hungary and Argentina. And in the first instance, it's a very comprehensive report. The first report is extremely comprehensive, and then every 4 years, it's then a little less comprehensive. But they essentially have to go through every article of the convention and explain how that has been incorporated in domestic law and what the effect of that is on the lives of people with disabilities. So they have to basically, as I put there, report on measures taken to give effect to obligations and on progress. There's a whole process whereby the state party submits a report, there's then a list of issues and questions from the committee, there's a discussion, and ultimately they adopt concluding observations on each report. Now the concluding observations, if you read them, if you're from a particular country, you might be a bit disappointed, just because they tend to be very politically, not very politically, but rather politically nuanced. They're trying to encourage the state. It's an engagement with the state. It's not like cases we take to the European Court where we say the Lithuanian government's law on legal capacity and institutionalisation is outrageous and in violation and blah, 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 blah. You know, it's a different approach. The approach is to engage and to try to get change over a period of time. So they commend the states on certain things and then they will express concern on certain things. So it's all very muted, kind of political, nicey nice is the word that comes to mind, language. But at the same time, they do identify where the gaps are. So they have, for example, identified across the board gaps with respect to inclusive, accessible education and been really clear that that's an important thing. And in fact, I mean, the 5 things from looking at the very small sample we've got so far, which is just the 3 reports, there are 5 things that strike me at least as being kind of themes. One is that the committee seems very interested in the consultation with and inclusion of people with disabilities in the whole implementation of the convention. That seems to be across the board. They frequently underscore the need to adopt strong legal definitions of disability and policy approaches. So with respect to Tunisia, for example, they suggested that the Tunisians change their definition of disability to include people with psychosocial disabilities, which were presumably not currently covered. The third thing is there's an interest across the board in institutionalisation and legal capacity issues. So they've suggested review of guardianship laws, for example, in the various countries. Fourthly, as I mentioned, there's an interest in accessible, inclusive education programs. And the fifth is across the board, they've asked for more information, more data on people with disabilities, particularly on violence against children with disabilities seems to be something on which there just isn't enough information for the committee. Now, it's really important to remember that the committee only has information from the government. The government is, in terms of the formal process, it's the government that provides the information, unless we as civil society organisations and national bodies in each country actually get involved and influence that process, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the opportunities to engage, there are many ways to engage with the treaty bodies. The first is to influence the preparation of your state party's report. And some governments are very keen to, in the preparation of their own report, to talk to civil society, to talk to DPOs, to talk to NGOs about what they think, what should go in the official report to states. And there have been cases I know of where NGOs have essentially written the state party report, which is great because it's given a more realistic view of human rights in that particular state than perhaps would have been done if it was drafted by someone from the Ministry of Justice. Then there's a possibility to influence the report on national monitoring framework. There's the shadow reporting option, which we'll talk about next. There's the use of the concluding observations. When you have the concluding observations from the committee, they're a really good peg for media and publicity because they are critical of the state. I mean, I've been reading concluding observations for 15 odd years, and there's never one that doesn't have something that you can't jump up and down about and say, hit the government over the head with in terms of lobbying and advocacy. And urging law reform with respect to something the committee identifies. In terms of litigation, they're great because they identify what the committee already believes to be gaps in the state's compliance with the convention. So if they say we're concerned about inclusive education in this particular country, then that's a good indication that it might be a nice time to take a case on inclusive education to the committee against that particular state. So they provide hints on what the committee's thinking. And you can also participate in days of discussion, submit papers. The committee calls, on its website, has calls for consultation for papers on various things. And it's really up to you to engage. If you don't engage, you can't expect the committee to do what you want them to do. Sounds ridiculous. We're now going to talk about state to shadow reporting in detail. And for that, it's the Janet and Rosemary show. So we have another PowerPoint presentation. Well, which one's yours reporting? Before we start, are there any questions on all of that? That's a lot of information for 10 minutes. No? Crystal clear. It's so simple, isn't it? It's great. Okay, shadow reporting.